Hello, world history students. This is Mr. Everton, recording the vid notes the same morning that you write them down in a packet. That's exciting. Today we're starting a new unit, Unit 7. And Unit 7 is about an ugly topic. It's about imperialism. You may already know what imperialism is. Maybe you have no clue. Maybe you have like a vague idea. It's represented here by this cartoon of England as an octopus with many arms reaching out and taking over lots of different places. Imperialism is about when one country takes over another country in some form or fashion. And so we're going to have a whole unit about that. It's something that happened a lot in the 19th century and involved much of the world. So let's get started. First off, let's define imperialism. Imperialism is when one country controls another. And there's a variety of ways they can do that. They can use military force, straight up roll up with soldiers and Navy ships and, kill people and take things over. Or another way they can do it is through economic policy. They can offer economic rewards to another country for doing what they want, right? Or they can say well, we're not going to trade with you unless you do this and this. And then there's other political negotiations that can happen where one country is using its influence to get another country to do something. And so there's different levels of imperialism, right? It's a spectrum. It's also just an idea. It's an idea that doing this is a good thing. And in the 19th century, European countries thought that taking over other countries was a good thing. We will talk about why that is. But let's address some specific kinds of imperialism. One kind, colonialism, or establishing colonies. A colony is when the imperialist country completely takes over the other country and they establish their own government in the place, and then they send their own people there to go settle, right? So the United States started off as a colony where colonizers came to the United States, which was not called the United States at that point in time, and killed, cheated, and otherwise displaced the indigenous Americans who lived here, and then established their own colonial governments and basically replaced all of the indigenous people. So that's one form of imperialism. Another form that you might not know as much about is called a sphere of influence. And that's when an imperialist country isn't officially in charge of a place, but they do have enough influence that they can create the changes that they want, right? So they've done something to this other country to make the country do what they say. Even though they're not officially in charge, they're basically calling the shots, telling the other country what to do. And then there's a protectorate, which is where the imperialist country offers to protect another country, but in exchange gets what it wants. So the United States did this with the country of Panama, where they were hey, we really want to build this canal. And Panama was and then the United States was and we're going to make sure nobody ever messes with you. And in exchange, you're going to let us build this canal. And Panama was okay. So that's another kind. So we've got colonies, which is the most intense, and then spheres of influence, which are a little bit less intense. And then there's protectorates where, they're still they're being imperialist. They're taking over another place, but they're doing it with a nice look to it. Oh, we're protecting you. Okay. So why did Europeans want to do this? During this time period, Europeans used these different forms of imperialism to take over a lot of Africa and Asia. And the main reason why they did it was because they needed raw materials for their factories. We talked in Unit 6 all about industrialization and how Europeans were changing their economy so that they were making things in factories and then selling them. Well, your factory isn't going to do you any good if you don't have raw materials to put into it. You can't make textiles if you don't have cotton, right? So England is very interested in getting cotton from places like America and Egypt and India. Other kinds of raw materials that they use, palm oil, which comes from West Africa, which you can use comes from these palm nuts that you can get the oil out and then you can use it to lubricate the machines. Just your car engine needs oil in order to not shut down. These machines need oil too. You can also turn palm oil into soap. And then rubber, which is another really important industrial material, which comes from the sap of different plants. And there's a lot of them in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of them, which is what you might call Vietnam or Malaysia, and then also a lot from Central Africa. And one of the ugliest stories of imperialism is Europeans taking over Central Africa in order to get rubber, which they needed for things like bicycle tires and to make their machines run, etc. Now, one reason is raw materials. Another reason is nationalism. Europeans really valued having colonies, not just because of the money, but because of the prestige, because of the clout that they felt like it gave them. Britain, far and away, had the largest colonial empire, the largest imperialist empire, and they were very proud of that. And they had a whole slogan about it called an empire on which the sun never sets, meaning that the British Empire is so big that at some place in the world, the British flag is flying over a place where it's daylight, right? So if it's like nighttime in Great Britain, the sun is up in Australia. If it's nighttime in India, the sun is up in Canada. So like they've got so many colonies all around the world that the sun is always shining somewhere on the British flag, which is like, I guess, a cute little slogan, but when you consider all the death that it involved, it's not as great. But they were very proud of it. They thought that it made them super special. Another reason to pursue imperialism is multinational corporations, which got their start during this time period. Corporations like Nestle and Shell Oil that you may have heard of, Dole Pineapple, which is an American company. And these multinational corporations usually have their headquarters, They have their headquarters in Europe, and then they get their natural resources from places like Africa and Latin America and Southern Asia. So like Unilever, which is a corporation you might not have heard of before, is still a multinational corporation today. It was founded during this time period. Originally, it started off as a soap company, the Lever Brothers Soap Company. And in order to make their soap, they would go to Africa to get palm oil. Today, Unilever owns all of these different brands, many of which you may have not seen before, but many of which you have, like Skippy peanut butter, Dove soap, Ragu, Vaseline, St. Ives, Suave, VO5. I mean, it's a lot of different brands. A lot of those multinational corporations that were founded during this time period, they still exist, and sometimes with different names, but they're still there. And then finally, and this is not finally last, but certainly not least, another reason why Europeans pursued imperialism was because new technology made it possible. It wasn't that Europeans didn't want to take over Africa. It's that until now they couldn't, because Africans were really good at fighting and would stop them. But Europeans invented the machine gun, where all you have to do is turn a crank and it spits out bullets really fast. And so ends up mowing down all these African soldiers. Or these steamships with cannons on them. They can just sail them up a river and start lobbing shells at people. And nobody else can really compete with that anymore. So new industrial technology makes Europe militarily very, very powerful. So that's the why. That's why Europeans did this. Now, that's not what Europeans said. That's not the story that they told. You may remember when we talked about slavery, and it's important to know that slavery is over by now. Slavery ended in the middle of the 19th century. But Europeans can't just come out and say, well, we like being rich. So they have to dress it up, right? They have to make it sound better than it is. So one way that they tried to justify imperialism was through something called a civilizing mission. So this very racist idea, and you'll see that all of these justifications are super racist. This idea is the idea that non-white people are less civilized, that Europeans have perfected civilization to some extent, and that now they're going out to the rest of the world and teaching them how to be as good as the Europeans. A lot of times this involves Christianity, right? Like this French monk is teaching Christianity to these African boys in Central Africa. Here you can see a school set up in Papua New Guinea by some Europeans who are educating these local Papua New Guineans, dressing them up in European style clothing because, that's how you be civilized. You got to wear European clothes. You got to learn the European language. And they're teaching them some skills, but they're also teaching them to be more European. Another way that Europeans tried to justify imperialism is through something called social Darwinism. Now, in biology class, hopefully you have learned that Charles Darwin is a very important figure in biology, And he came up with the idea of evolution, which is a thing that exists. And part of evolution, according to Charles Darwin, is that different beings will mutate and they will improve, and some of them won't improve. And the ones that are stronger and better will live long enough to pass their genes on to their children. And so positive adaptations will be passed on to future generations. So sometimes this is called survival of the fittest. The animal that is most equipped to live will live, and the animals that are weak will not. So this is a biological idea. Well, some non-scientists got a hold of Charles Darwin's idea, and they said, hey, you know how that works in the animal kingdom where the big animal eats the weak animal? That's like countries too. Like all these African countries are too weak to stop us with our machine guns. Therefore, it's just survival of the fittest. It's totally fine that we Europeans are taking over other countries around the world who are too weak to defend themselves. That's just the way that nature works. So that's an idea that they came up with, social Darwinism. Great idea, guys. I'm being sarcastic if you can't tell. And then a whole other variety of scientific racism, like just wide-ranging theories that had no real solid evidence. The experiments were, when you look at their methodology, it was really flawed. But like lots of like measuring different skulls, trying to claim that there are inherent biological differences between different ethnic groups, and that always coming to the conclusion that white people are biologically superior and intellectually superior to non-white people. So trying to justify all that with science and to say like, well, you know, it's just the way things are. White people have this biological advantage, not their fault. They were just born that way, which there's no biological real difference between the races except like melanin in the skin and a few other like surface level things, but the DNA is all pretty much the same. This is bad science being used in order to justify things that Europeans wanted to do in the first place. So now hopefully you understand what caused imperialism, and you can write an answer in 3 to 4 sentences, which is a huge topic. There's no way you don't have 3 or 4 sentences worth of stuff to say about imperialism. I'll talk to you next time.